contrary to what a lot of the teams did with their new head coaching hires, instead of going with the young offensive-minded coach who happens to have known Sean McVay, the Broncos went the opposite direction, and they went with Vic Fangio, who has been the Bears' defensive coordinator the last several years. Before that, he was in San Francisco with Jim Harbaugh, and then previously had also been at Stanford with Harbaugh, and I believe with the Baltimore Ravens at one point also. Not only did they go defense, but, Fangio's an older coach. He's not like he's, in his early 40s. So they're kind of bucking the trend, but the rumor leading up to this was that Elway knew that they've got a good defense, and they want to ride that defense in the run game. And I think with the hiring of Fangio and their new offensive coordinator, Rich Scangarello, they're definitely fitting in that role. So what we're going to do, let's take a look at both sides of the ball and kind of look at how that affects maybe how they're going to draft. Offensively, Scangarello is a Kyle Shanahan disciple. He had been traveling with Shanahan the last several years. He was with him in Atlanta, and then most recently he was his quarterback's coach in San Francisco. So it'll be kind of curious to see what style of offense he runs. He's never called plays in the NFL before. So you tend to think, okay, let's take a look at the Shanahan style offense and if they're going to kind of rely on that. And a couple of things that really stand out is Kyle Shanahan, he always enjoyed the quarterbacks that could be put on the move, a lot of boot action. We saw that with Jimmy Garoppolo. We've seen it in, to some extent in Atlanta with Matt Ryan. Everywhere he's gone, they've done a lot of boot action and rollouts. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. Now that they've traded for Joe Flacco, Flacco's not the greatest athlete, but he's better than most people give him. So I could definitely see him kind of like they used Matt Ryan in some limited boot action. Who knows if they'll draft one? I think there's a strong possibility that they do. And I think all the top prospects that they're looking at in the first round, whether it's Daniel Jones, Drew Lock, Dwayne Haskins, all of them can, be involved in that boot action. A couple other things, the Shanahan offense isn't your typical West Coast offense. He's kind of blended it. A lot of zone running scheme. I think this is going to really benefit the Broncos backs, Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman. I think both can excel in a zone running scheme, inside zone, outside zone. Royce Freeman, I know everyone was, high as the moon on him when he got drafted. I think he's a solid back. I think a zone scheme is perfect for him. Let him go north and south, hit that, put a foot down and get going and build up some momentum to use his size. Phillip Lindsay, I think, is scheme transcendent, but, once again, he's got that explosive speed. You look at what they've had in the past. I think Phillip Lindsay could be similar to Devontae Freeman, how they used him in with the Falcons, and then kind of how they used Jerick McKinnon, or how they plan to use him in San Francisco. The hiring also means that their fullback, Andy Janovich, will have a role. The Shanahan offense has always utilized a fullback. If you remember at San Francisco when Kyle got hired, they went out and signed Kyle Juszczyk. With the Falcons, they had Patrick DeMarco. So if you're a big Janovich fan, Jano is going to be a big part of this offense. I think his ability to catch the ball, to block, and to kind of be used all around the formation will be utilized. The Shanahan offense uses a lot of 21 personnel, 2 backs, 1 tight end. So that definitely fits that. Speaking of the tight end, they like to use the tight end a lot in motion and move them around. The Broncos don't really have, I wouldn't say much for tight ends. Jeff Howerman was on IR. Jake Butts never really recovered from his bull injury, so on and so forth. So You got to wonder maybe is tight end, and I had heard through the grapevine that tight end was one of the positions that the Broncos were heavily scouting. I don't think they take one with their 10th pick, whatever it is. Noah Fant, T.J. Hawkinson are the top tight ends. I think that's just a little rich, just because the amount of defensive talent. But if they took Noah Fant, it wouldn't shock me. But it's a deep tight end class. Irv Smith Jr. could possibly be. Is probably going to be there at their second round pick. Caden Smith from Stanford's another guy. Caleb Wilson probably in the third or fourth round. It's a pretty deep, relatively deep tight end class. So I think they'll be able to get somebody that kind of fits what they want later on, probably day 2 or 3. Offensively, as I mentioned, zone blocking scheme, something that the Denver Broncos fans are used to with Kyle's dad, Mike, and Rick Dennison, and all those guys. Gary Kubiak, when he was head coach, they ran that zone scheme. So I think a lot of their guys are equipped for it. Garrett Bowles, I think, is very equipped for this zone blocking scheme. They're going to want more athletes over maulers. I could definitely see them adding some depth later on in the draft. But once again, I don't think they address it early, just because I think getting some guys back from injury, scheming it up, and then having getting some guys that really fit the scheme will definitely help. All right, let's switch it over to the defensive side. Fangio's defense, he's a 3-4 guy, but the thing about him is, he blends a lot of the 3-4, 4-3 under. If you look at that Seattle-style front that they have, it's basically, that or a 3-4. It's basically the same thing. When he was in the San Francisco 49ers and even the Chicago Bears, he tended to want outside linebackers, those pass rushers that could play either a weak side 4-3 defensive end or, basically a stand-up linebacker. So he's got that in Von Miller. He's got that in Bradley Chubb, Shaq Barrett. They've got, pass rushing is not going to be an issue. In Chicago, he had Khalil Mack and Leonard Floyd. He's got similar type guys in those roles. So that's not going to be too much of a change. Defensively on the front, he doesn't necessarily need a big run-stuffing nose tackle. He wants a guy that could play the one technique that just can shoot the gap and really hold his own in that gap. So they got D'Amico Petco, journeyman guy. I think he's adequate enough in that defense. When the Bears had Fangio, they drafted Eddie Goldman in the second round, so maybe they look at finding a similar guy, maybe a DeMarcus Christmas at some point. It's a pretty deep defensive tackle class, so they'll be able to find somebody. At their two ends, they like the guys that could switch between a 5 technique and a 3 technique. We looked at Akeem Hicks. You've looked at guys like Justin Smith and Ray McDonald and so on and so forth. So those kind of 3 techniques that are athletic enough. I think Derek Wolfe will be a perfect fit within that. Another guy that could play the 5 technique at times, could play the 3 technique. I think DeMarcus Walker is an interesting guy. He's similar to Jonathan Bullard, who the Bears drafted. Probably better, though. Matt Ioannidis is there. I could definitely see them adding someone. The Bears drafted Bilal Nichols last year. He really thrives, so they may take a flyer on a defensive lineman later on. Inside linebacker, Fangio always wants 2 inside linebackers that can kind of do it all. Can run and chase, play in coverage, come up and stop the run. He's had good linebackers wherever he's gone. The 49ers, he had Patrick Willis and Navarro Bowman. With the Bears, they had signed Danny Trevathan and Jarrell Freeman right away, and then ended up drafting Nick Kwiatkowski and then Roquan Smith. And then so it was Roquan Smith this year and Danny Trevathan, and they had those 2 guys that kind of do it all. With the Broncos releasing Brandon Marshall, this makes this kind of even bigger of a need, and you have to wonder if they don't go quarterback with that 10th pick, if taking a linebacker is a possibility. Devin White from LSU is sitting there available. More than likely, he could definitely fit that Roquan Smith type role. He's not as good as Roquan Smith, but Similar type of prospect that can kind of do it all. Devin Bush, if he's available in the second round, could definitely be a possibility. I don't think Mack Wilson falls that far, but I think those are your 3 top linebackers, and I think Devin White is definitely a possibility in that first round. It's not it's not that deep of a linebacking group, but if you kind of look at what the teams Fangio's been on, they've always drafted linebackers early or had impact linebackers, so just kind of something to keep an eye on. Secondary-wise, he tends to like bigger corners, usually around that 6'2" mark. If you look at the Bears, they had Kyle Fuller, was about 6'2", Prince Amukamara, 6'1", 6'2". When he was at the 49ers, they had guys like Carlos Rogers and that. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. The Broncos could definitely use a corner. Bradley Roby, I think, fits well. And then Chris Harris, I think I could see them sliding him into the nickel. But I definitely think they add another corner at some point. I don't know about that first-round pick just because, after Greedy Williams, you're not gonna. The only other corner you're gonna take that high is Byron Murphy, and he doesn't really fit the profile that Fangio would want. So I definitely think they pass on him, even though I think he's a tremendous player. Secondary, once again, they kind of want guys that can play multiple, play both the free and the strong. You look at what they had in Chicago with Eddie Jackson and Adrian Amos. Both of those guys were interchangeable. You look at what he had in San Francisco with Eric Reed, a guy that could play free or strong. Jaquiski Tart was there. So they had guys that could kind of do multiple things. So I think they're set at safety between Simmons and Darian Stewart. Once again, wouldn't be surprised if they add someone just to get more depth. But safety is a pretty strong position for the Broncos. They got a pretty strong defense, I think, for the most part, other than adding maybe a linebacker early on. That's about the only starter, maybe, finding some different fits along the defensive line. There's not going to be a whole lot of player turnover, I don't think. And look for the Broncos really to rely on this defense and the running game to try and win games, similar to what the Bears did this year. So it'll be fascinating. I'm a big fan of Vic Fangio. He's a straight shooter, good, strong defense, tough personality. I think the Broncos got a good hire while everyone's going one way. They went the other, and I think it could really benefit them in the long run. So there's your Denver Broncos and their new coaching staff under Vic Fangio.